over to you if you would like to share your screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliet. Yes, this is our third session, and I'll just have a brief review of why the point of this third session. So I'll just share with you my screen. This is on meditation and the spiritual life. Just a quick review. We mentioned that the purpose of meditation is first to have equanimity in life, and this for 100% of those who are meditating. And the second is to attain self-transcendence, which is for a very small percentage of people who are meditating. I've mentioned in our first session about the dynamics, the principles of the practice of meditation, and that we're speaking about mainly our mental level when we do sit down and do meditation, consisting of two layers, concentration and meditation. But meditation cannot be separated from the other levels or layers of our consciousness. First, with our habits, desires, the things that we have grown up with, and secondly, later, on our spiritual nature. So during our second session, we covered the integration between daily life and meditation. This involves our habits, emotions, patterns of thought, and that we have to work this out such that there will be no conflict or minimum of conflict between the meditational silence and then our personal habits and tendencies. And this evening, we'll touch on the upper part. This is on our spiritual nature. And for this, we need to integrate all of them, not just meditation, but all of them. Now, let me just start by sharing with you the nature of what we call spirituality. First, we may have noticed, all of us have noticed, that human life seems to have a certain recurring pattern. For example, we are born, we go to school, we find a job, you get married, have children, we grow old and die. And what do our children do? All children will also grow up, go to school, find a job, get married, have children, grow old and die. And how about our children's children? They will grow up, go to school, find a job, get married, have children, grow old and die. And our great-grandchildren will grow up and do the same thing. Now, is this pattern really what we call human life? There comes a point in our lives when we begin to ask, there must be something else in this. And we begin to be discontented with the normal pattern of living. We more or less know all these needs, having a job, having a stable family, having stable finances, and so on, as well as the biological processes until we die. So there comes a point in our lives when there is an inner vacuum, a yearning that cannot be satisfied by physical, social, emotional, or mental activities or pleasures. This is sometimes called the divine discontent, that can only be satisfied by the realization of our inner, true spiritual self. And this path to realization, this process, is called mysticism. What is the mystical life? The mystical, or the spiritual life, is the perception of a reality. Take note of the word perception. It is not a belief system. It is not a dogma or doctrine, but a perception of a reality that transcends the day-to-day worldly life and which has a higher or deeper significance. There is often a conflict between this inner perception and one's behavior and the values of outer reality. The mystical life is called by many names: contemplative life, intuitive life, spiritual life, practice of the presence, transcendent life, prajna consciousness, ananda, and so on. William James, together with other psychologists, have written, personal religious experience has its root and center in mystical states of consciousness. You will notice that in these statements, it is about experience and not about a belief system. A person may believe in his or her religion fervently, absolutely, and yet it may lack the experiential nature of spirituality, so it remains a belief system. And if the person suddenly finds a better religion, a better viewpoint, a better philosophy, then that religion will be changed by another one. But religious experience or spiritual experience is somewhat different. It is something which is encountered and which has a cumulative value. We grow by it, and the insights that we gain are things which we know to be true, and not simply because we think that they are true. There are stages in the spiritual quest, and for this purpose, I'd like to partly make use of stages which have been identified by many mystics as well as writers on mysticism. Normally, our human life consists of sorrow and suffering. There are moments of pleasures, happiness, but whenever we lose them, then we feel sorrow, and when it is intense, they become suffering. And this is when we begin to look for things, and there is an awakening. It is the initial quivering of what is called prajna or intuition, and it creates a divine discontent, a questioning process, such that even our religions, we question them about the truth of them, about the value of daily life, of worldly life. And this questioning process itself is already part of the awakening, because when this intuitive nature, consciousness, is not yet awakened, then this questioning will not happen. As a result of this questioning, the individual would be asking questions, searching for solutions, answers, read books, listen to lectures, study different religions. It is a search for the path. And the searching may take years and years, or it may be a short time. It depends on the karma of the individual. And upon finding the path, then when it is an authentic spiritual path, then the person will invariably find that there are common guidelines or rules in the path. First is the need to purify oneself, the cleansing of the lower self, and the integration of the higher, what is sometimes referred to as the dark night of the senses. Then there's a need to nurture the higher consciousness through meditation, an awareness of subtle thoughts, development of the radiant mind or the intuitive mind. And then one comes to a state of illumination. This state of illumination doesn't mean that one already has a sudden enlightenment experience. No, it can even come gradually. It has been known as illumination, enlightenment, realization, satori, bodhi, and other things. Then in this stage, because illumination, the spiritual life has various sub-stages. So there is a need for higher purification, which is sometimes called the dark night of the spirit. And it is a long process too. And finally, one attains to a state of union, what we call samadhi, when the sense of ego fades away although it may still come back. But this sense of oneness with whatever is experienced is oftentimes called union in Christian mysticism. In Eastern mysticism, then there is another stage where there is an annihilation of the self, nirvana or fana. These processes, insights, learnings regarding the mystical life have been known to not only hundreds but thousands of mystics. Many of them have written of these, although they would say that it is very hard to describe these states, and yet they have written so many books about them. People like, for example, Plotinus, Dionysius the Areopagite, Meister Eckhart, Jacob Boehme, Teresa of Avila, and so on, up to the modern times. And we'll find that in all of their writings, there is a common thread, such that the mystics of one religion, or even if one doesn't belong to any religion, the mystics can understand each other across the borders of religion or nationality or race or even time. And it is from this that we gain a kind of certainty regarding the nature of the mystical life or the transcendent life, because it has been confirmed and affirmed for 1, 2, 3,000 years already, and the essential elements remain the same. The awakening process can be gradual, it can be sudden. A modern mystic, a Jesuit, Father Anthony de Mello, has written, he has a book called Awareness, and this is the first sentence of that book. He says, spirituality means waking up. Most people, even though they don't know it, are asleep. They're born asleep, they live asleep, they marry in their sleep, they breed children in their sleep, they die in their sleep without ever waking up. They never understand the loveliness and the beauty of this thing that we call human existence. There's a story about the Buddha when he was asked, what's the difference between you, the Buddha, and us? And the Buddha simply answered, the difference is simply this: I am awake and you are not. Then there is this pupil of Gurdjieff, who has written a lot of books about Gurdjieff's system. He also says that one day he was in a subway or in a train, and as he was standing there, he realized that people are asleep. They are moving mechanically, making decisions mechanically, and they are not really aware in a deep and real sense. Evelyn Underhill says that awakening is a disturbance of the equilibrium of the self, which results in the shifting of the field of consciousness from the lower to higher levels. Sometimes, she said, the emergence of the mystical consciousness is gradual, unmarked by any definite crisis. The self slides gently, almost imperceptibly, from the old universe to the new. Then, as I mentioned, one searches for the path, and one may jump from one movement to another, from one religion to another, from one philosophy to another. But eventually, such an individual will come upon a portal, a valid mystical portal. It may be within his own religion or her own religion, or it may be in a non-religious context. And in those paths, whatever they may be, there are always two stages or two processes that are important. The first one will be the nurturing of the inner intuition through various spiritual practices, and the second is the self-mastery of our conditioned habits and reaction patterns. This process of self-transformation is essentially a lifetime process that involves these two practices. it will involve future lives, not just in one life. So we have dual work in the mystical life. The first one, on beginning from the higher mental to higher levels, is the need to awaken and nurturing of these levels of consciousness. And the second would be to master and purify our lower conditioned personality. And as we mentioned earlier in previous sessions, there is a constant tug of war or conflict between the higher nature and the lower nature, such that this will last for an entire lifetime or many lifetimes, and we have to work things out such that these conflicts will cease and we become integrated. So we can take a look at our consciousness like this, that our consciousness consists of conditionings, preferences, influences, and personal values, as opposed to transcendent consciousness, which may begin to be awakened in somebody whose mystical consciousness has begun to emerge. Now, in the personal life, you will find that there are many influences, consciousness, belief systems, habits, and so on. And we will find that our attention span is just a small part of our consciousness. In this picture, we'll see that there is a white circle covering a few of the conditionings, becoming aware of those conditionings. But there's still a lot of conflict among those which we are not conscious of, whether it's conflict between one personality habit or another, and between our personality and our inner perceptions, inner values. And when we practice meditation or daily self-awareness, then our consciousness expands. And whenever it expands, it becomes aware of conflicts. And whenever we become aware of conflicts, then we are in a better position to resolve it because we are now aware of conflicts. Oftentimes, a person is not aware that there are contradictory qualities in himself or herself, but he or she is not doing anything about it because he isn't fully aware about this conflict. But when one begins to become aware of the conflict, then this conflict will not be sustainable, and hence it will begin to be resolved one way or the other. And each time that we become aware, this conflict will diminish or cease. And as we increase our self-awareness, we'll begin to be conscious of the many conflicts within our personality. When we become aware through meditation of this inner awareness, this intuitive perception, which is spiritual awareness, we become more aware of the conflict between the innermost values and the outer habits. This keeps on growing and growing as we practice in daily life as well as in meditative practice. The presence of this awareness in our consciousness until we may be able to expand our consciousness to cover even the most subtle levels of our consciousness as well as the subtle layers of our personality. And here, when we are able to do this, we will be able to integrate the higher and lower personality and attain self-mastery. There are three stages, rough stages, in major stages in the process. The first stage is when our lives, our minds, our feelings, our consciousness are fragmented. There are parts of our consciousness that function separately and in conflict. Reason conflicts with emotion, lack of awareness of tension, stress, and other distressful experiences. So this is the state of an average person. When the person begins to practice meditation and becomes aware of the spiritual life, then one goes into the second level, which is integration. Conflicts are resolved, a person becomes more capable, becomes more effective, resulting in general effectiveness in whatever work chosen. And finally, transcendence. A person begins to have this higher sense or perception, which is intuitive or spiritual wisdom added to capability, one becomes non-ego-centered and attains the highest level of maturity. These two levels would bring us to a state of being an integrated person with a transcendent consciousness. And these are the qualities of a mature person, a mature and then a spiritual person. And these are our aim. In meditation, in our practice of the spiritual life, this is our aim. First to be integrated, then to be transcendent, and then this integration and transcendence become just one movement. All this entire process requires a deep degree of inner awareness, nurtured by meditational practice and daily self-awareness. This quality of awareness is probably the most important key to all of these, but because without it, then this cannot happen. In the Christian tradition, it is called recollectedness. Saint Teresa of Avila, in her book, The Way of Perfection, says, practice recollection. Recollection is the same as mindfulness or awareness. Practice recollection many times daily, if not do so occasionally. As a nun grows accustomed to it, she wrote this book, Way of Perfection, primarily addressed to her nuns in the Carmelite order. So as a nun grows accustomed to it, she will feel its benefits either sooner or later. Once the Lord has granted it to her, she would not exchange it for any treasure. If you practice it for a year, or perhaps for only 6 months, you'll be successful in attaining it. Think what a short time that is for acquiring so great a benefit. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the word used is watchfulness. In Philokalia, which is a mystical compilation for the Eastern Orthodox churches, it says, watchfulness is a spiritual method which, if sedulously practiced over a long period, completely frees us from impassioned thoughts, impassioned words, and evil actions. Watchfulness is a way embracing every virtue, every commandment. It is the heart's stillness, and when free from mental images, it is the guarding of the intellect. One of the effects of this awakening process and awareness process is impersonality. The lower part, body, emotions, and the lower mind constitute our personality, and we tend to think of things in terms of our benefit, in terms of our point of view, in terms of the ego, the benefits, the welfare of one's ego. But when once we begin to nurture our higher consciousness, then impersonality begins to grow in us. Impersonality doesn't mean indifference. It means that we are able to see things objectively without necessarily being swayed by our personal likes and dislikes, our personal self-interests. Here are examples of personal as well as non-personal approaches to things. For example, we can appreciate things. Maybe you appreciate your computer, maybe you appreciate your book, but that appreciation is not personal, and hence there is no desire or attachment connected with it. It can even be money. You appreciate the value of money, of comfort, of whatever things that money can bring, but there is no desire or attachment for money. If you lose it, then you lose it. Then you just earn it again if you need to. So there is an appreciation, a just appreciation of what these things can bring to life, but it is not attachment. Another aspect of appreciation is appreciation of people. We genuinely appreciate them and we say so, and we don't even have to flatter them. So that in the case of personal interaction, sometimes we tend to try to please other people, and that's a kind of trying to flatter them. There is an ulterior motive to it. But a genuine appreciation of another person is just an appreciation, and we say so. In a personal life, we have desires, and when those desires are filled, then we feel satisfied. But satisfaction is different from an inner joyfulness that is spontaneous and does not depend upon the satisfaction of any need. Whenever we say something that is funny, in a personal side, oftentimes we can be sarcastic. It can even be deprecating, putting down people. But in a non-personal way, humor does not put down people. It is just seeing the funny situation of human life in general and not putting people down. In personal relationship, we tend to be opinionated or defensive when we're interacting with people. But when one has begun to awaken one's impersonal nature, then one can listen unconditionally. It is not about agreeing or disagreeing, we just listen to understand. Then, on a personal level, oftentimes we are attached. We want to possess people. We want to be with people. And when they are away, we feel loneliness and grief. But in a non personal way, we can have active compassion, loving, and affection that is not afraid of losing them. In other words, if they go away, it is accepted. It's something that can be accepted. Whereas when there is attachment, then there is grief and loneliness because one would like to continue such a kind of interaction. So this cleansing process is very important. Cleansing of our personal nature, desires, attachment, and so on. The mystic Richard of St. Victor says, the essence of purgation is self-simplification. And Evelyn Underhill says, nothing can happen until this has proceeded a certain distance, till the involved interests and tangled motives of the self are simplified and the false complications of temporal life are recognized and cast away. There's a mystical work being used by many Protestant denominations. It's called Theologia Germanica, popularized by Martin Luther. No one knows who's the author of this. And in that book, it says, no one can be enlightened unless he first be cleansed or purified and stripped. In the same book, there is also a statement. Nothing suffers in hell except the self. I've not forgotten that phrase, which means that when the ego or self ceases, then there's no need for hell. Nothing can suffer in hell. I'm just using the word hell figuratively because I don't believe in an eternal hell myself. But it means suffering. Whenever we suffer, it is because there's an ego who will suffer. But when this ego has been purified, then where will be suffering? There will be none. Then we are eventually introduced to the need for non-attachment, detachment. Because when we are attached, we cling to something. And detachment is an absolute prerequisite. St. John of the Cross said that in detachment, the spirit finds quiet and repose, for coveting nothing, nothing wearies it by elation, nothing oppresses it by dejection, because it stands in the center of its own humility. For as soon as it covets anything, it is immediately fatigued thereby. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, detachment is one of the requirements for the attainment of the practice of yoga, the results or the fruits of yoga, which is stillness of the modifications of the mind. This is realized by means of first persistent practice and second is detachment or vairagya. Evelyn Underhill refers to the process of detachment as a negative aspect of the spiritual process, dynamics. The negative aspect, the stripping or purging, the stripping or purging away of those superfluous, unreal, and harmful things which dissipate the precious energies of the self. This is the business of poverty, or detachment, or simplicity, or true humility. Then, the positive aspect. This is the raising to their highest term, their purest state of all that remains, the permanent elements of character. This is the higher triangle in our diagram. This is brought about by mortification, the gymnastic of the soul, a deliberate recourse to painful experiences and difficult tasks. Take note that it is painful because we are attached to it. That's why sometimes it's called mortification. We mortify, and whenever there is no longer attachment, then there is nothing which can feel the pain anymore. So the stages of growth in our spiritual life can be identified as beginning with sorrow, disappointment, susceptible to unhappiness, victim of environment and conditioning, and then a cleansing or structure building, personal effectiveness. This structure building is an important part of maturity, meaning we cannot just become spiritual without developing maturity of our personality. For example, in daily life, in our worldly life, we need to know certain skills. If we don't develop these kinds of effectiveness in our personal structure, we'll just find that we are ineffective in the worldly life. And this brings about not only uh, disappointment, what we call failure, uh, then fear, then poverty, hunger, to those extents. And so we need to develop general competency in life. Then we become free from personal unhappiness. Then we make use of rational action. True rationality is impersonal, but it is an impersonality which is consistent with affection and care. Then we awaken compassion and service orientedness, emergence of intuition, and then the mystical life, then liberation and reality. Each of these levels we have to go through. In some levels, longer, others shorter. Saint John of the Cross is known for uh, his famous teaching on the dark night of the soul. And in another, that's the title of his book, Dark Night of the Soul. But there is another book he has written called Ascent to Mount Carmel, um, which summarizes again these teachings on the dark night. There are two dark nights, according to him. The first one is the first night, or purgation, is on the central part of the soul, and the second part is of the spiritual part. The first night pertains to beginners, occurring at a time when God begins to bring them into a state of contemplation. In this night, the spirit likewise has a part. Why is it for beginners? Because it's about our personality, our desires, our attachments, our likes and dislikes. And whenever we begin to cleanse this, then it becomes a dark night because it will involve suffering and pain. That's why it's called a dark night. And it is the senses. Why? Because it is about our attachment to things. The second night, or purification, pertains to those who are already proficient, occurring at the time when God desires to bring them to a state of union with God. And this latter night is a more obscure and dark and terrible purgation. Now, some people would not be very comfortable when St. John of the Cross uses the word God, but you can use a substitute to it. It can be divinity, it can be reality, it can be the absolute, but the process is similar. Then there is another book, a very well-known book called The Cloud of Unknowing, written by a 14th century monk, Catholic monk, who wrote this in order to guide uh, the, the, the more junior monks in his congregation. The title is called The Cloud of Unknowing, and you will see why that's the title. In the diagram on the left side, you'll find that in the center there is a symbol of a circle with some sun rays, solar rays. So that represents our consciousness. And it has two directions. The first direction, downwards, is towards our attachment or attraction towards people, towards things, towards the worldly life, towards money, social position, and so on. And then later, that person may also be drawn upwards towards the spiritual life. But in doing so, then that person must go through a dual process. The first one is that the person must go through a cloud of forgetting. This is equivalent to the dark night of the senses of the person. This is called purification. And in other words, we let go of our attachment to the worldly life, to people, to money, to things. The writer calls it cloud of forgetting. Of course, we don't forget it, but it is symbolic of the state wherein which we are indifferent to it already. It is a requirement, it is a necessity. And then later, as we go deeper into our spiritual life, then we go into another phase of cloud. Another cloud, it's called the cloud of unknowing, wherein which the person must let go of many things which he has been harboring. For example, belief systems, concepts of God, concepts about goodness, religion, and other things, about the dogmas and doctrines of a religion. These things must eventually go. That is the reason why it's called the cloud of unknowing, because knowing becomes now an obstacle to the realization of that which is beyond knowledge. Whenever we know, then we are stuck on that level of knowing and knowledge. But we must go beyond it, and therefore all conceptions of spirituality, divinity, God, all these things, they must go. And one must just enter into the state in pure quietness, no thoughts, no words, no conceptions. Now, let me go into theosophical literature. And one of the greatest, to my mind, one of the greatest works on mysticism is this little book called Light on the Path, dictated to Mabel Collins. To my mind, it is one of the most highly inspired works ever given through the Theosophical Society. And here, in addition to what we may learn from other pathways like Christian mysticism or yoga, we find in here, in the Light on the Path, certain very short aphorisms which help us understand what we need to go through in order to enter into the path. I will not cover many areas of the Light on the Path, but I would encourage each one of us to really go into it almost line by line, because the aphorisms are very short, very, very, sometimes it's just one sentence, but it means a lot. And hence we have to go through it sentence by sentence. In the first part of this book, Light on the Path, it tells us, it says, before the eyes can see, they must be incapable of tears. What does it mean? Before we can see reality, the eyes does not refer to our physical eyes. It refers to the eyes of inner perception. Before we can see reality, we must be incapable of tears. Why? And what is tears? Tears refer to emotions. Tears refer to preferences, liking and disliking. So it's not just emotion, but also mental attitude towards things. When we still have these personal preferences, reactions to things, disappointments, depression, anger, fear, then we cannot see reality as it is. Why? Because these tears, these emotions, these preferences will color our view of reality. For example, we would look at death as if it is a horrible event. we don't see that death is just a part of a long process of growing, and that it is neither desirable nor undesirable. It is just part of it. But whenever we have fear or dread of death, we cannot see the role of death, and hence we cannot see the reality of the role of death. Then it goes to the second phrase. Before the ear can hear, it must have lost its sensitiveness. Meaning, before I can hear what you're saying, what the teachers are saying, what I have to learn from, I must have lost my sensitiveness, which means my reactiveness to any kind of criticism, feeling that I have to defend myself. So whenever we are defensive, we find that we cannot really listen to the insight, the advice, the wisdom of the person talking to us. But when we are no longer sensitive, if the person is saying something which is false, then we see it as false. If it's something true, even if it means critical of our habits, then we realize that it's true and we can easily adopt it. Before the voice can speak in the presence of the masters, it must have lost the power to wound. What's the master here? It doesn't necessarily mean a master outside, like a Mahatma. It refers to our inner, the higher self. And before we can even try to approach it and try to address it, try to become conscious of it, our voice, our way of communicating must have lost the power to wound. What is this power to wound? Anger is an example of this power to wound. Whenever we are angry, we tend to want to hurt people. And hence, whenever we wish to communicate, then this tendency must no longer have the capability of hurting people. And before the soul can stand in the presence of the masters, its feet must be washed in the blood of the heart. It refers to the need to go through countless experiences through lives about pain and sorrow, and then we are willing to let go of them and be able to go into our inner higher self, or a real teacher like a master or Mahatma. Now, here is another section. I'm just choosing a few things about from the at the feet of the master. Here is another portion. It says, seek in the heart the source of evil and expunge it. It lives fruitfully in the heart of devoted disciple, as well as in the heart of the man of desire. Only the strong can kill it out. The weak must wait for its growth, its fruition, its death. And it is a plant that lives and increases throughout the ages. It flowers when a man has accumulated unto himself innumerable existences. You will take note here that the light on the path covers not just about the experiences for now, but also looking at the span of our growth for a long period. A very immature soul cannot go through the mystical path because the immature soul must go through the process of growth from the lower levels, from the personal level. It says, the weak must wait for its growth, its fruition, and its death. It flowers when a man has accumulated on himself innumerable existences. And it is only after that, then you will find that we must then expunge it, let it go, let it disappear. But before you make it disappear, it must appear first. And hence, our process of becoming a human being, becoming egoistic, is part of the growth process. But eventually, we must let go of it. And then it says, in another later part, look for the flower to bloom in the silence that follows the storm. Not till then. This flower that is referred to is the spiritual side in us. It shall grow, it shall shoot up, it will shoot up. It will make branches and leaves and form buds while the storm continues, while the battle lasts. But not till the whole personality of the man is dissolved and melted. not until it is held by the divine fragment which has created it as a mere subject for grave experiment and experience, not until the whole nature has yielded and become subject unto its higher self can the bloom open. Take note again, the personality must dissolve and melted. It is the purification, purgation process, and then the bloom will open. Then we go into what is called illumination or enlightenment. And Evelyn Underhill attempts to explain all pleasurable and exalted states of mystic consciousness in which the sense of I-hood persists, in which there is a loving and joyous relation between the absolute as object and the self as subject, fall under the head of illumination, which is really an enormous development of the intuitional life at high levels. As I mentioned earlier, this illumination and enlightenment may come suddenly, but usually it starts imperceptibly. It grows like the sunlight in the morning. It doesn't just become bright all of a sudden. It is something that grows bit by bit and you don't even notice it. Certain people who have gone through this before in previous lives, then in this life, they can easily come to it. And that's the reason why there is the possibility of sudden illumination or enlightenment. In Christian literature, the word mortification is often used. And personally, I don't like it very much because it sounds too negative. But the idea in mortification is to let the old self go. So Evelyn Underhill, whose classic book on mysticism it has focused a lot on the Christian tradition. It says, the object of mortification is to kill that old self, break up its egoistic attachment and cravings, in order that a higher center, the new man, may live and breathe. In psychological language, the process of mortification is the process of setting up new paths of neural discharge. That is to say, the mystic life has got to express itself in action. And for this, new paths must be cut and new habits formed, all in spite of the new self's enthusiasm against the grain, resulting in a complete sublimation of personality. Then union. Union refers to oneness with the divine. Union is the true goal of the mystic quest. In this state, the absolute life is not merely perceived and enjoyed by the self, with a capital S, as an illumination, but is one with it. It is a state of equilibrium, of purely spiritual life, characterized by peaceful joy, by enhanced powers, by intense certitude. In this stage, there cannot be any images of forms. This is the reason why the religious aspect, the ordinary religious aspect, disappears in mysticism. The soul can never attain to the height of the divine union so far as it is possible in this life through the medium of any forms or figures. St. John of the Cross states, we receive this mystical knowledge of God clothed in none of the kinds of images, in none of the sensible representations which our mind makes use of in other circumstances. Accordingly, in this knowledge, since the senses and the imagination are not employed, we get neither form nor impression, nor can we give any account or furnish any likeness, although the mysterious and sweet-tasting wisdom comes home so clearly to the inmost parts of our soul. And this is the reason why the cloud of unknowing says we must go into the state of unknowing. Then finally, there is this concept of annihilation of the self. The self is just a temporary vehicle of the consciousness. And Underhill describes it as peculiar to Oriental mysticism because the state of union in Christianity is not the same as the annihilation of the self in Oriental mysticism. She says, Oriental mysticism insists upon a further stage beyond that of union, which stage it regards as the real goal of the spiritual life. This is a total annihilation or reabsorption of the individual soul in the infinite. Such an annihilation is said by the Sufis to constitute the 8th stage of progress, in which alone they truly attain to God. Thus stated, it appears to differ little from the Buddhist nirvana, and is the logical corollary of that pantheism to which the Oriental mystic always tends. Thus, Jalaluddin said, "Oh, let me not exist, for non-existence proclaims in organ tones, to him we shall return." In the Buddhist classic, The Light of Asia by Edwin Arnold, it says, "The Judah slips into the shining sea." Where's the Judah? No more. It's part now of the shining sea, and the sense of ego or the self disappears. Let me share with you some suggested steps in the mystical life. It must start with clarification of our priorities, because when things are not clear to us about what's important really in life and what's not, then we tend to be carried away by the pressures of society, by the pressures and values of what we have grown up in. And we need to develop self-mastery over habits and conditionings. This is an absolute necessity. And we are battling and engage in this battle throughout our lives, even for those who are highly advanced in the spiritual life. Then practice daily meditation, because it is our way of being in touch with the subtle layers of our consciousness. Then render service without seeking reward. This is a practical direction in letting the ego fade away. Then being non-attached and impersonal, but compassionate and loving. Compassion and love are due not to attraction, but because of a sense of unity with all life. So we are non-attached to individual lives, but we are one with all life. Then there's a need for the practice of daily self-recollectedness or awareness, and be aware of the transcendent while living the worldly life. Now, let me just mention, before I close our session, about H.P. Blavatsky's diagram of meditation, which is very familiar to Theosophists. It's one of the most advanced set of guidelines in the living of the transcendent life. I'll just quickly go through this without too much commentary, because many of you are familiar with it, but it covers this dual process in a very straightforward manner. The contents of this diagram of meditation can be written in one single page of paper, and yet it covers very deep and very profound and very transcendent layers of the practice of the transcendent life. She first starts by saying, conceive of unity by expansion in space and infinite in time. And you will notice that when you do this, you cannot think of anything in particular. You just have to go beyond normal thinking. Then, meditate logically and consistently on this in reference to states of consciousness. Then, the normal state of our consciousness must be molded by 3 acquisitions. In other words, it must now grow into certain states. Number 1, the perpetual presence in imagination in all space and time. The word used by Blavatsky is imagination, but I think we must not confuse this with the usual use of imagination, which is image making, because this presence in all space and time has no image, and therefore it is not imagination in the usual sense. It is rather a consciousness in all space and time. And she says, from this originates a substratum of memory which does not cease in dreaming or waking. Its first manifestation is courage. With memory of universality, all dread vanishes during the dangers and trials of life. Number 2, continued attempt at attitude of mind to all existing beings, which is neither love, hate, nor indifference. The perception in all embodied beings of limitation only. People, the world, life and death, these are all limitations. And when we deal with people, we do evaluation, assessment, or criticism without praise or blame. And then this acquisition is completed by the conception, I am all space and time. Beyond that, it cannot be said. These are the acquisition. Then he speaks of 5 deprivation. Now take note that these acquisitions belong to the higher triangle, our higher sense of self. And these 5 deprivations are about the lower self. So she identifies 5 critical areas that we must let go of. First, constant refusal to think of the reality or awareness of the unreality of, number 1, separations and meetings, associations with places, times, and forms. These are mainly about people. And secondarily, places and other forms. And if we see that these are unreal, then we have freedom from futile longings, expectations, sad memories, brokenheartedness. All these, by the way, are the words used by Blavatsky as taken down by one of his pupils. The only ones that I've added are those in brackets, just to clarify what it is referring to. Then, secondly, the unreality of the distinction of friend and foe. This results in absence of anger and bias, replaced by impersonal judgment. The third one is the unreality of possessions, because we actually don't possess anything. We are just temporarily making use of things, but we don't really possess them. And this frees us from greed, selfishness, and ambition. Then, fourth is personality, the unreality of personality, about our ego, our self-importance. Then this frees us from vanity and remorse. And finally, the unreality of sensation, things that give us pleasure, satisfaction, and this frees us from gluttony, lust, and so on. And then these deprivations are produced by the perpetual imagination without self-delusion of I am without, the recognition of there being the source of bondage, ignorance, and strife. And there is no risk of self-delusion if the personality is deliberately forgotten. Then this deprivation is completed by the meditation I am without attributes.